I'm Gary Weatherly. I'm a professional scenery and lighting designer. I've designed over 400 productions all over the Southeast. I'm also a teacher, and I just retired from teaching at Mountain Brook High School for 23 years. I'm going to be talking to you about scenic painting. You know, painting is the last thing that you do usually when you're building your set. It's going to be the surface that most people see when they come and see your set. Um, so this painting that you do on your set helps to create the idea of what the surface is, the tonal value, the textures. These are things that you're trying to do with scenic painting. So it can make a 4x8 flat into a brick wall, or it can make it as a living room with wallpaper, or a backdrop can become a forest scene outside. Most of the tools and materials that you're going to be using for scenic painting are pretty affordable. You can get them at the hardware store. They usually will fit in most everyone's budget, even though there is pretty limited. Um, so I'm going to talk to you about some of the tools and materials that you're going to be using, and even though you maybe have had some experience in scenic painting, I think there might be some things there that will be helpful hints to you as well. After that, I'm going to also then demonstrate some of the painting techniques. I'll actually show you how to do some of the techniques, and with you practicing and mastering some of these, it's going to bring your painting surfaces to a different level. It's going to help give you some confidence in what you're doing, and you will gain some proficiency in your skills of scenic painting. So first, let's talk about the tools. And paint is the main material that you are going to be using. You want to use a water-based flat paint, which when you do scenic painting, the flat paint is used because you want to be able to control the reflection of the light on the stage, and glossy finishes will give you a glare. Water-based paints make it very easy to clean up and to mix the paint. Now, most schools probably are currently using house paint for their scenic painting. It's usually very affordable. You can pay anywhere from $12 to $15 per gallon. Some groups may even be able to get it for free. The hardware store oftentimes messes up their mix of the paint, and people don't want it, and then they have to give it away because they can't really remix it. This house paint is usually latex or acrylic, which is water-based, and it makes it easy to clean up. But you want to be careful. If you get this paint from the hardware store, you want to make sure you buy flat. If they're giving it away, make sure it's flat, not the semi-gloss or the gloss paint. This is going to make it harder for you to do your scenic painting. You're also stuck pretty much with whatever the color is that if they're giving it away, whatever the color it is that it is, because you usually can't change it. There is nothing wrong with using house paints, but for scenic painting, professional scenic paint is by far the best choice. There are many brands out there that you can use. The most affordable is probably Roscoe's off-Broadway economy line of paint. But even this economy line of paint will outperform by far any of the house paints as far as giving you textures, color saturation, and even quality of the binders. Now, even the economy line is expensive. It's $45 to $70 a gallon, depending upon the color. Now, most schools don't think that they can afford this, and most can't if they're going to use it the same way they use house paints. But I'm advocating that using professional scenic paint can help you in the long run. It can be as economical as house paint if you use it correctly. And so what I want to do is try to show you how to use the scenic paint. By far, it's going to outperform any of the house paint that you end up using. So here are the arguments usually for using house paint. It's cheaper by the gallon. is good for basing out previously painted surfaces, and it's readily available, and you can even sometimes get it for free. Now, here are the disadvantages for using house paint. It's inferior quality. It doesn't dilute well and still cover the surfaces. You can't get vitality of saturation of color. You can't really mix these paints to create a new color. Usually mixing them just gets brown or gray. You also have heavier buildup of paint on the paint surfaces because you can't dilute these paints and still be able to cover. Now, I use house paints. I'm going to tell you. It has a place in my scenic painting materials and tools, but I primarily use it as a base paint to paint out previously painted surfaces. I also use it as a primer for wood. It has very little place when I'm actually doing scenic painting. The only time that I'll use it is I will use white and I will use black house paint to help tone shades of colors. But otherwise, I'm using scenic paint. The primary disadvantages of scenic paint are its cost. But I'm hoping that with my demonstrations that I can show you that this can still be an economical way of using paint. Um, the primary advantages of using scenic paints are that you're going to be able to mix colors. You can actually take red and you can take blue and get a purple or get a lavender color. You can't do that with house paints. There's too much filler and too much added white base into house paints to be able to mix them. You also can get tone. You can mix these scenic paints with house paint to be able to get different tone and values. The other thing is that with scenic paint, you can dilute the paint down so much more so that you're not having buildup of paint on the surface of your canvases and of your flats, and it allows you to repaint these much more than you would if you were using just regular house paint. Next, I'm going to talk about brushes. This is the next tool that you're going to be probably using the most. One of the types of brushes that are great for students to be able to use are these, I call them chip brushes or China brushes. You can buy them at the hardware store. They're really inexpensive, and if you end up ruining one, which is going to happen, especially when you have students uh, trying to paint, they're not that expensive. They're only about $75 to $3 a brush, and you can get them in different sizes. They're very cheap. They're not um, they're not good for lining or doing anything, but they're really wonderful for just mixing, and you can easily use them for some of the painting effects that we're going to be doing. And in fact, you'll see me using some of them and when we do the demonstrations. So this is going to be a handy brush to use. As I said, it cleans up fast and quickly. If you end up ruining the brush, it's not a big loss in investment, and but you want to try to clean these brushes and keep them around. I have some chip brushes that I've used for years, and I still have some hanging up above the sink in our scene shop that the students have used. Eventually, they're going to die, but they are a good thing to have at the beginning. Another type of brush is a better quality brush, and Purdy, Purdy, is a company that makes these. You can buy other types of brushes at the hardware store. I really like these Purdy brushes. They keep their bristles are keep their point. They are very good at discharging the paint in a very uniform and smooth manner. You don't have the paint just rushing out of the brush all at once. The chip brushes will rush out pretty quickly. But you can also do nice blending and shading and lining with these brushes as well. You can buy them in different sizes. They come in 1 inch all the way up to like 4 inches, but they are kind of expensive. They'll range in price from $6 to $30 depending upon the brush. And this isn't necessarily a brush that you want to destroy. You want to try to take care of these brushes and keep them because they are an investment. I have some pretty brushes that I've had for over 10 years and they're still working well. So if you take care of the brush, it is something that can hold up for you for a very long time. You're also going to need some bigger size brushes, especially when you're doing large areas and painting large areas. You need to have a brush that can hold more paint and be able to just to put the paint onto the surface in a much wider area. So you want some 3 and 4 inch brushes that are pretty wide and pretty big so that you have these to be able to spread paint very quickly into large areas. And the last type of brush are these scenic fitches, which are very expensive, but they're wonderful for mixing paint onto the surface. They're also very good for lining, um, and so I've have pictures of these as well to show you. But these are really more like artistic brushes. Um, they they hold a lot of paint. They really um, uh, give off the paint and discharge the paint in a very nice way, in that it doesn't plop out all at once. Um, so it's a very good brush to be able to use. Another tool that you'll want to have around is rollers. Rollers are great for using for base painting, trying to quickly cover up painting surfaces that have already been painted so that you have a clean surface to paint on again. You'll want to use rollers for that house paint that you're using to try to roll on things. This allows you to really paint surfaces quickly and to get the paint onto a surface very quick. One of the disadvantages with rollers, you need to control the paint coming out of the roller. A lot of people will dip it into paint and then start rolling. That's not the best way to be able to do this. You need to use the tray and use the slanted part of the tray to control how much paint is in the roller, and so that when you're rolling, you're able to control the paint. You don't want to build up big um, areas of a blob of paint. You want to spread this paint out with the roller and really cover the surface and make it uniform. So rollers are really good. They come in a larger size, um, which is great for big areas, but you also can get smaller size rollers that allow you to paint thin strips and smaller areas, and be a little more controlled with the amount of paint that you're actually putting on the surface. So both of these are really handy. You want to try to have rollers in your toolbox. Another tool that is very handy are sponges. Most people think about sponges being the commercial kind that you use when you're at the sink and you're washing your dishes, and these can be useful. I'm not saying that they're not, but the sponge that is the most useful for scenic painting are sea sponges. They're natural sponges, and these can be kind of expensive. A large sponge can cost up to $10 or more, and but the sponge has natural voids and natural areas in the and shapes to be able to give interesting textures when you're trying to use this on when you're doing scenic painting. Um, I have used the synthetic sponges to try to cut them and use them as stamps and stamping on leaf patterns and things like this. So there are a lot of uses for the synthetic sponges, and there are things that you can do with those that makes it kind of interesting. But you're going to find more use with a sea sponge That gives you really some interesting textures and blends, and I'll demonstrate some ideas for you as we were going through the demonstrations. Another tool in your toolbox are going to be sprayers. These are really, really handy. I have painted entire surfaces with just a sprayer before, and let's talk about first what type of sprayers. One that you might find, but isn't necessarily that useful in most, especially amateur scenic shops, are the pneumatic sprayers. These you can fill up with paint and you can spray, but you're going to need a compressor to be able to use these. They also really make a mess. They're hard to control. You have to. They're good if you're doing large, big areas, but they're not so good if you're trying to do small things and trying to control more of the paint. These really are used more like for house painters and to paint a lot of surfaces at once. And it certainly is a way that you can paint your flats and things all at once if you wanted to. Um, I find that using the rollers are actually better. But the sprayers that are more um, common and something that you'll be using probably more and be more useful in your toolbox are these garden sprayers, or they're sometimes called Hudson sprayers, and they can come anywhere from a quart size, as I have shown in this picture, all the way up to a larger gallon and 2 gallon sizes that are sometimes made of plastic or metal. And these sprayers, you can put your paint in it and you pump up to create, you have a pump that's on top of the sprayer that you're able to pump up to pressurize the paint. And you also usually have a nozzle that allows you to adjust how fine you want the mist and or the spots to come out of the sprayer. The only thing you have to do with this sprayer is that you cannot use full strength paint. You have to dilute the paint. The paint needs to be diluted down to no thicker than whole milk. Um, Anything thicker than that is going to end up clogging up the sprayer. It's going to clog up um, the nozzle, and it's going to clog up the filter that's built into the sprayer. As I said, I've used the sprayer to actually um, paint entire surfaces, and I'll show you some pictures of some surfaces that were painted with just the sprayer. It gives a lot of texture, especially if you use several different colors. I use the sprayer a lot for spattering, and a technique that we're going to talk about. And the good thing about using the garden sprayer is that you really only need to use like a dust mask when you're using it, or sometimes you don't even have to use that if you're going pretty heavy with it. Um, but the pneumatic sprayer, you're going to need to use uh, a respirator because the it's going to put fine particles in the air, and you don't want to breathe those things, which is another reason the disadvantage of using the pneumatic sprayer is that you're going to have to use a respirator for that to really make it safe. Also, with the garden sprayer, there's no real fumes. There's just you're just using water and very watered down paint to be able to do it. And so just a dust mask is usually sufficient, and don't really need anything else. One last thing that you need to do is you want to protect your investments. Um, Granted, most of these things don't cost a lot by themselves, but adding up, it's a quite a bit of money that you're talking about when you're investing in scenic painting. So one of the things you want to do is learning how to clean the tools that you have. One of the things you want to do when you're is washing the brush. You want to make sure that you get the brush clean. A lot of times that means I use a slop bucket, and it's just a bucket of water, and just put things in it that I'm going to wash. This helps to break up the paint and to get it so it's not so much in the bristles anymore. There's soap that you can use. You can use any kind of dish detergent soap is fine. This works well. And the way to clean them, the best way to do is put a little soap onto the brush, and then brush your hand. Clean. Actually, this will end up working the paint pigment out of the bristles, and I end up, just kind of brushing the bristles. You don't want to try to put too much pressure on the bristles, but you want to try to end up getting it clean. Rinsing. And then one way of easily getting paint out is slinging the brush, sling the water out of the brush into the sink, and that will also get things out. Then try to arrange the bristles so that they're rather clean. Another soap that you can use is Murphy oil soap. This is really good too to use for natural bristles. For natural bristles, because it conditions them a little bit as you're cleaning them. So again, you do the same thing. You would want to try to suds up the bristles in your hand, and you're just kind of rotating the bristles around in your hand. Then you can take your hand and kind of go through the bristles, trying to get out the pigment. Notice that the suds is pretty white, so that means most of the all the paint, or most of the paint, is out. But usually I try to wash the brush twice, just like I've shown you here. By washing it twice, usually it is going to be clean by the second time. So, rinsing it, as I said, slinging out the paint. The good thing about washing a brush this way, it also cleans your hands. So if you've got paint on your hands, it's a great way of getting those clean too. The first painting technique I'm going to talk about is scumbling. Scumbling is when you're going to take two or more colors and you're going to brush these onto your surface, and you're going to blend those two colors or more together on the edges to create a modeling effect within your surface. So I've got a little demonstration here to show you about scumbling. All right, so we're going to scumble first, and we're going to take the red paint, and I'm just going to put on dabs of paint. And just kind of do it randomly. And then I'm going to get most of the paint off, and then I'm going to take another color, a yellow ochre, and just put it on. And you've got to work, when you're doing scumbling, you've got to work fast, and you've got to work in small areas. I've got a really small area here, but if you're doing a big area, you've got to work fast. And then you're going to start taking the brush and moving this stuff around and blending it so that you have the edges of it blending together. And what you're doing is you're making a modeling effect on your flat that will end up creating the texture that you're wanting when you're doing this. So I'm just creating this texture and not worrying about what it's going to be yet. But what I'm actually working on is a brick pattern. So I will be doing this and creating the background, and then this way I can get different varieties of bricks that are going together, and then so you end up having a scumbled look to everything. You can work it a little more if you want to. The biggest problem with scumbling is overworking it. As you're working, you've got to make sure you don't work it so that everything becomes just an even color. You want those different colors to be in there. You want them to be blended in together. The chip brushes work really well for this for students. Students, you can give them several colors of paint and tell them to go to town. and they can scumble, and you'll probably have to check in with them occasionally, making sure that they don't over blend. But you can then start blending things together, and it ends up making a texture background that you then can create your bricks on. So once you do your scumbling, you would let this dry, and then we will talk about how to do bricks. Okay, so this would be scumbling. When you're scumbling, you don't want to overwork the areas. You don't want the painting surface to become uniform. You want it to be the different shades and the different colors, which one blends into the other, which blends into the other. That's the effect that you're wanting. This will help you to create your brick wall or your background for your wallpaper, or any of those marble, or even the clouds in the sky, to help hazy clouds in the sky. Um, these are all done with a scumbling type effect. Another technique is dry brushing. Dry brushing is using a stiff brush with stiffer bristles and being able to drag it across a surface, a dry or a wet surface, and drag it across to create a pattern. And the bristles will actually end up creating these lines. I'll demonstrate how this is done. Next, I'm going to demonstrate dry brushing. Dry brushing, you're going to use the brush and the bristles. These chip brushes work really well for dry brushing. Usually the finer brushes, the really nice brushes, are going to give you much too clean of a line. So one of the things that you're doing when you're dry brushing is you want to get most of the paint out of your brush. So that means really you want to control the paint anyway. So when you're dry brushing especially, dip it in to the paint, but then dab it on the sides of your can to get most of that paint out, because you're wanting the paint to actually flow with the bristles that are here. And so then you're lightly going across and creating a dry brush effect. So this is really good for trying to do wood graining kind of effects, and to try to give another texture to your surface. Especially if you're trying to do a rough kind of texture, this works really, really well. And you can also go cross and create this cross hatching with it as well, which is kind of interesting. Or, as I said, you can try to do it as a wood grain kind of thing. Also, as you tilt your brush, you can get different effects so that you can begin to get some of the things getting closer, a little more narrow, so that the wood grain is not always perfectly even, if you're wanting something like that. And you could when you're doing this dry brushing effect, you of course want to paint your background. I'm doing it on white so it's easy for you to see, but you want to paint your background, and then you're going to use a different shade or a different color to do your wood graining or your dry brushing effect. So for instance, if I did a really dark brown here, I might want to use yellow ochre as something to go across to bring up a lighter color on top of that dark brown. I could then do several colors if I wanted to, so that you're ending up having several colors going across, which gives you more depth. And again, I'm going to use the yellow ochre here on top of this, but you can kind of see how this gives you a little more depth by putting in a different color. So you can imagine if you had a dark brown, did a couple of shades lighter brown, and then a yellow ochre on top of that, you can begin to get some really detailed wood graining effect with the dry brush. This is really good for creating kind of a graining effect, wood graining effect, or it can be used for a sort of burlappy looking effect. Stenciling is another painting technique. You can buy pre-made stencils at craft stores and places like this that have, very flowery and decorative kind of motifs that you could paint on. Use the stencil to paint on wallpaper, or you can make them yourself. You can actually take cardstock and draw the image that you want, and then cut that out um, with an X-Acto knife and be able to make your own stencil. If you're using cardstock, then I recommend that you draw what you're wanting to do, and then cover it with packing tape, and then cut it out so that the surface doesn't absorb all the paint and begin to deteriorate. You can also make it from these plastic, uh, these for rent signs that you can see at the hardware store, that kind of sign, or some sort of thin plastic material. That is very good for making a stencil. I've even seen like overhead projector film material being used for stencils because it's a plastic made material, and so therefore you can draw what you're wanting, cutting it out, and at least it doesn't absorb the paint as you're trying to do it. When you're actually stenciling, you want to use either a brush, or you could use a sponge to sponge in the space that you've cut out, sponging in a color so that you end up creating the texture that you're wanting with the stencil of maybe a wallpaper pattern, or some sort of decorative motif that you're wanting to stencil on. The next painting technique is called glazing. This is taking very watered down paint and painting it onto the surface so that the coat that's underneath, the color or the pattern or the textures that are underneath, can still show through this. And what you're doing is you're toning the painted value that you already have there. On this one, I'm going to demonstrate glazing. Glazing is using very, very thin down paint. You need to glaze on top of something that is already dry. What you're doing is giving it more dimension. And glazing is very handy in using in marble work, in trying to give depth to stonework and that kind of thing. But you need to dilute your paint. I've got some water here. I'm going to take a little bit of paint and just dilute it way down, and mix this up. And I'm going to use this, and I'm going to glaze some areas of this just to give it a different look. So what I'm going to do is I'm not going to try to be I'm going to be random and organic in what I'm trying to do, because I want it to end up looking marbly or like stonework. So by glazing, you're using very thin paint and allowing the texture and the paint that's underneath it to actually still come up, but to tone and give value to the areas that you're trying to glaze. So I'm just taking this orange and I'm kind of brushing over some areas here, and as I said, I'm not trying to necessarily do anything, a pattern. I'm just trying to be organic with it and try to give, and also to allow the glaze to kind of blend in and just be, I'm using just water to blend the edges of the glaze just into the surface so that I don't have really a hard edge where the glaze was. And it just kind of when it dries, it just kind of blends in together. So you can build up, with glazing you can build up some techniques and dimension within what you're painting. And in fact, when you're scenic painting, what you're doing is you're using all of these different techniques to try to create the surface that you want. You're creating everything, the surface, you're creating marble, you're creating wood, you're creating wallpaper, you're creating all of this with paint. And so you need to be able to use all these different techniques to be able to make the audience from the audience point of view believe that it is wallpaper and not just a flat that's got paint on it, and or it is a marble staircase and not just a wooden steps that you've painted to look like marble. And that's the whole idea of scenic painting, is to try to create something um, that you're fooling the eye of the audience member to think it is something that is really not there. So I put one color on the glazing. I'm going to do a second color, make it a little darker, and again, I'm trying to allow, the paint needs to be thin, and I'm trying to allow the paint to show through what is underneath it. And I'm using some water to just kind of blend the edges of this. But already I'm getting much more depth within what I'm working on here by creating some glazing areas to give it a little more depth, allowing texture and the sponging technique that's underneath this to still come through, but to give it some more life. One thing I would do is after this, I would probably allow it to dry and then spatter this. And I'd probably use a finer spatter rather than a thick spatter to start blending into some of those edges. Glazing is great for distressing because you can take kind of this watered down, kind of yucky looking color and kind of sponge it or paint it or spray it into different areas, and it gives it a dirtier look. So distressing an area, a lot of times when you paint, scenically, you paint, everything looks brand new because it's just got painted. So glazing and trying to distress down areas to look like it's a little more worn is a really good thing to be able to do to try to make something a little more believable. So glazing floors, glazing marble, glazing walls, especially like where light switches are, because that would be an area that it would be used more. Glazing just to create different textures as well within marble, that is a very handy way of doing it. Glazing, like I said, you want to have very thin paint doing this, thinning it down to sometimes as much as 1 part paint, 10 part water. And then when it dries, you can see there's a color variation in what happens. You can also take water on the edges of glazing and make it blend in easily into the surfaces that you already have painted. You can also take a rag and dip it into the watered down paint and then roll it over a surface area to get a texture as well as to glaze an area. Um, Sheets of newspaper and newsprint and fabric, all of that stuff can use for glazing. Besides, and it can create subtle types of shapes and texture within the glaze and with what you're doing. Glazing is also used very much for cast shadowing. I often take purple and water it way down and then use it with my brush underneath lines to create the feel of a cast shadow of something being recessed back. A lot of times you need to line the edges of things to give them a definitive shape. Lining is often used to try to um, really bring out the edges of some of the things that you're painting, especially if you're painting everything on a flat surface. You want it to look a little more 3D. Lining is a way to actually make that happen. When you're doing lining, you want to make sure that you use a really nice brush. One of the pretty brushes that's beveled on the edge works really well for this. Okay. I'm going to next show you how you're going to use this piece that we did as scumbling, and I'm going to turn this into bricks and show you how to do that. One of the things that's really helpful with bricks is being able to do a line for the grouting. And I use one of my more expensive brushes, the pretty brushes, and I use the ones that are beveled, and that really creates a nice line. Again, you want to be careful and not have a bunch of paint in your brush. You'll end up just making a big blob. So whenever I get the paint, I always dab it on the side, and then I'm going to use a lining stick. This is a piece of molding that I have attached a handle to it. You can get this and cut them into different lengths if you want to. This is really handy. I have several lining sticks, big ones that I can stand up and use that has a handle with it. I'll photograph one of those for you in a few minutes, and then also these shorter ones, which can then be used to make the lines. And because it is a piece of molding, it's already beveled on the edge, so that way you don't, whenever you draw your brush across it, you don't have it running underneath, because it'll just run along this edge, and it doesn't have the edge of the board to actually take the paint underneath the board. So I'm going to go ahead and just do a couple of lines on here and create the brickwork. Now, if I was actually doing this, I'm doing it really quick so that I can show you, but if I was actually doing this, I'd probably measure all this and be able to draw it out. But you get the idea that, you can quickly get the bricks in there and get that. I think I did one in the wrong place, but that's okay too. Let's do this. Here, you can get an idea, so that you can get the bricks in place. So right now I've got one line going. I can also create, using another line, try to get the water. I usually always have a slop bucket mixed by, just a water bucket that I call a slop bucket, but is to be able to rinse my brush out if I need to. So I'm mixing up a little bit of a color to make a whiter color to do a highlight. And I can just use the lining sticks and do the same thing here. So I'm going to come across, and I'm going to okay, so you can see, and I can also do it across the side. And see, once you get the scumbling on, you can then begin to get these patterns of bricks by just doing the lining with it. The next thing that we're going to do is afterwards, and usually you want things to dry between, and of course I didn't dry, but you get the idea. I'm doing it kind of quick to show you. But you can easily line out your brickwork. I've done entire walls of brick, and usually I do them not standing up like this, but on the floor. And I use a lining stick that actually is a big piece of crown molding with a handle on it, and I'm able to do the bricks that way. So lining is something that you're going to want to do. You can line free-handed, um, especially curves and things like this. You just got to be careful. And then, of course, lining, using a lining stick, which is another tool, is really handy in being able to make straight lines, and especially long straight lines. I have a lining stick that I can use, with my hand, but also I have one that I use when I'm painting things on the floor, and I can put this up, and then take my brush that's also on a bamboo stick and draw lines. Spattering is the next technique that I want to go over. Spattering is something that you're trying to create tonal value as well as texture onto the surface. Okay, when you're spattering, you want to use very liquid paint. You don't want to use thick paint at all. For one thing, when you're spattering, you want the paint to create dots on your surfaces. And what this does is it begins to blend the shapes and the colors that you have, and blending those together so that it makes it a little more uniform. It works in the same way that if you think about the old comic books, the comics were printed with little dots of color which were right beside each other, and that those dots of color ends up creating the color that you actually see. And the same thing happens when you're doing spattering. It creates a texture as well as it begins to smooth out some of the rough edges that you have with this scumbling that we have right here. The spatter will end up smoothing a lot of that out and making it a little more uniform. So to mix up spatter, I'm going to use a bucket. I'm going to pour a little water in it. I'm not mixing up a lot because I'm not doing a very big space. But you want this to be pretty liquidy. So you don't want a lot of... And what you have to do, the more paint that you have in your brush, the bigger your splotches are going to be, or your dots are going to be. So you're going to end up trying to get a lot of the paint out. If you want a very fine brush dot pattern, you've got to get a lot of the paint out instead that you have very little. And then the best thing to do is to hit your hand as you're spattering, and it will end up putting the dots onto the surface. This is being able to control it. Being able to control. You can see I don't think I have enough paint in it. I'm going to put a little more paint because it's very subtle. So I'm dabbing the paint so that I'm taking out a lot of the paint out of the brush so that I don't have, and then I can and you probably can see this a little better. Oh.
There you go.
So it ends up putting a pattern onto the surface. Now you want to keep this flat while it's drying because it will run if you're doing that. But a lot of times I've taken, depending upon what kind of spatter I want, this is pretty fine dots. But if you take it out, I can also sling it, and it will create bigger patterns and bigger splotches on the surfaces. So So you could do it this way as well. And granted, you're going to get some patterns where where it's coming out of the brush, and that may be desirable or not. You got to decide. But you can, rather than just tapping your hand like this, which will give you really a fine pattern, you can also do a much coarser pattern by slinging the paint. And you end up getting a lot of texture onto the surface. You can end up doing this by doing several different colors. For instance, I've done this darker color. I could go to a lighter color and see if this is... And you can end up spattering several colors onto the surface. And now it really becomes much more interesting, having several colors on it. You could also use a sprayer. And when you're using a sprayer, again, you want the paint to be very, very thin so that you, but what you can do is when you're using a sprayer like this, a garden sprayer, and you can pick up these at Lowe's in the garden department. So you can buy this at Lowe's. You need to strain your paint because the garden sprayer will end up putting out lots of little dots for you, but you've got to make sure that you can control the paint. The paint, if it's thick, it's going to clog up the nozzle. And so whenever you're using a garden sprayer, you want to make sure you use a paint filter, and then I'm using a funnel, and then I can then pour my paint into the strainer. What you're going to do is, once you get the paint into the strainer, you can then close it up. It has a handy pump on top so that you can pressurize the paint. Okay, and then you also can adjust the spray. Usually what you're using in a garden, you're spraying a stream, but you don't want that. You want to try to control how much paint is coming out. You want it to end up being dots of paint, a spatter of paint, rather than a spray of paint. I usually take this and test it ahead of time. I'm just going to go ahead and just kind of narrow it down. I'm going to take another board here so that you can see what this looks like. But you can see with the sprayer, I'm also getting lots of dots. So this is another way that you're able to spatter your surfaces. The good thing about the sprayer is that you can spray a large area very, very quickly. And it makes it very handy. The more you adjust the nozzle, you can get to where you can define very fine dots or more coarse dots, more like splats if you wanted to, and all of that is creating texture that you can use in your scenic painting. So looking at this, spatter is one of the things that you want to use to try to, in your scenic painting, to try to give texture and to give dimension to the surfaces that you're painting.